questions and reflections time. Talking about part 7 of our series. So that's what? Again, chapter 2 cultures is... Oh, they didn't even do chapter numbers. Gaarder, why no chapter numbers? Alright, well anyway, let's get started with the first questions on from the handout. What was the most important of the 5 senses for Indo-Europeans based on the analysis of language in this book? And what significance does this have on the difference between the Indo-Europeans and the Semites, or Semitic peoples? Page 152 is where we're going. Okay? And we can see practically at the top of the page, all in all, we can establish the sight was the most important of the senses for Indo-Europeans. Right? The literature of Indians, Greeks, Persians, and Teutons alike was characterized by great comic visions. And he talks about visions and video in Latin and so forth. It was also characteristic for Indo-European culture to make pictures and sculptures. Wow. It was also characteristic for Indo-European culture to make pictures and sculptures of the gods and of mythical events. What significance does this have? Well, for one thing, and check out just a couple pages afterwards, 154, just 2/3 of the way down, he says, we said that the most important of the senses for Indo-Europeans was sight. How important hearing was to the Semitic cultures is just as interesting. It's no accident that the Jewish creed begins with the words, "Hear, O Israel." So, this distinction, first of all, we were talking earlier about the mystery of the polytheistic gods versus the mystery of the monotheistic gods. And we have, there's a case to be made that the monotheistic God of Abrahamic religions is more, in a sense, cryptic and mysterious in some ways, certainly less necessarily human-like for the most part, compared to the polytheistic pantheon. And so while there are tons of depictions, visual depictions, and so forth, of these gods, we get this very different sense from the Semitic religions, where the one god being cryptic, being, as it were, so incredible that our eyes could not possibly hear it, is only through the means of perhaps a less than primary sense, or a secondary or lower sense of we use our eyes all the time, and our ears too, but if you had to lose one or the other, which would you rather lose? Most of us would probably choose to keep their sight over keep their hearing at the expense of the other. Then, as it were, this secondary sense is the channel by which God speaks to us in this other way, this other form, this other culture. So that's the significance. What among the ideas in Jesus' message to his followers may have sparked the reason for his crucifixion? In the in-depth local lecture, we didn't talk much about Jesus, actually. And part of that is because I think Gaarder already does a pretty good job of going over some of the important differences there. Also, partly because I wouldn't call Jesus a philosopher per se. He was definitely a religious enthusiast, and as a Jewish rabbi, certainly had some very deep thoughts. But I wouldn't necessarily have called what he talked about a philosophy in itself. It required a lot of... we can have religious philosophy or philosophy of religion, talking about Jesus' sayings and messages and so forth, or his life to whatever extent there's anything historically accurate or not, or just simply mythological or legendary about it. But not much in the way of philosophy, as it were. Nonetheless, there are some interest... definitely captured the imaginations and certainly sent people into a very different way of relating to the monotheistic God, to such an extent, of course, that starting from earlier forms of Christianity, before Christianity or Christian was even a word, there were definitely was some deeper philosophical thought there that were spurred. But getting back to the question, 159 is where we want to look for this one, or maybe a good starting place anyway. I'd say this is the best spot here. About, again, midway down perhaps, or 2/3 of the way down. It says, blah, 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 blah. Let's see. In an ingenious way, he, meaning Jesus, used the language of his time to give the old war cries a totally new and broader content. It's not surprising that he ended on the cross. His radical tidings of redemption were at odds with so many interests and power factors that he had to be removed. Skipping a little farther down, too, just a line or two, with Jesus we see how dangerous it can be to demand unconditional brotherly love and unconditional forgiveness. Even in the world of today, we can see how mighty powers can come apart at the seams when confronted with simple demands for peace, love, food for the poor, and amnesty for the enemies of the state. You can go on and read some of the rest of this too regarding dying for the sake of humanity and so forth. The important thing here is that there is a very big distinction in the way that we even talk about God between the Old Testament and its covenant and then the New Testament and its covenant. And again, without going into the weeds on this topic, while the old God seems to be this almost sort of dictatorial, how do I put it? I want to say almost like a warmonger as you get further and further into the Old Testament, where he leads people to conquer other people and destroys people with a flood or by other means, by lightning, by all sorts of things. He's definitely a sort of a punishing figure. And the people he leads are pretty just unitary. It's not people in general. It's not. I think if you were to ask a Greek thinker, does the concept of ideas or Platonic ideas or forms and so forth, does that apply to just the Greeks or does that apply to everybody? Well, of course, they apply to everybody. Applies to all things. Notice how different this is in nature to you as a distinct specific people will get to come in and have this land of canon and so forth because I decree as such. Now that punishing mode kind of disappears as we get to the New Testament with a new covenant between ourselves and Jesus Christ, if you're a follower of Christianity. And then in that case, you have Jesus talking these themes of love and so on and so forth. And hopefully you got that from Gaarder. This whole looking out for the Messiah, looking out for the person that's going to bring about, that warmongering again and help us conquer. And instead you get a radically different approach through this man who says, love thy neighbor. You win by way of God, not by way of war, sort of a sense, or by way of punishment. It seems to almost be the undoing of the earlier ways of thinking of God in the Old Testament. Now, of course, a great deal of effort has been spent in trying to make these two parts of the Bible super consistent, and kudos to those who have. But it also has those glaring, almost contradictory elements as well. So it's something that often spurs confusion as well for people. Next up, what were the three cultures Alberto creates analogies for, as three streams that divided before coming back together at the end of the Middle Ages, and which philosopher was the primary focus of each stream? Now, that's taking us into the Middle Ages chapter, and the part I particularly want to look at is on 174. All right, and if you go about halfway down, the philosopher, Alberto, says, can you imagine a broad river that divides for a while into three different streams before it once again becomes one great wide river? And you can also see how the Greco-Roman culture was divided, but survived through the three cultures, the Roman Catholic in the west, the Byzantine in the east, and the Arabic in the south. Although it's greatly oversimplified, we could say that Neoplatonism was handed down in the west, Plato in the east, and Aristotle to the Arabs in the south. Then he talks about those coming to a confluence again, a place where they reemerge and start mixing again. Not that they weren't somewhat mixed to begin with, but just were pieced. We can say the greater part of each of those philosophical streams of Aristotle, Plato, and Plotinus, you could say, ended up being mostly preserved by these three different regions and their cultures. So there's a lot of oversimplification to this, naturally. Nonetheless, the three philosophers are already mentioned inherently in there, with the exception of Neoplatonism, which was obviously Plotinus's work. What is the problem of evil in theology, and what did Augustine draw on to resolve the problem for himself? This one, let's check out page 176. A couple of places on 176, mostly the same spot. Up towards the top, he, Augustine, was completely preoccupied with what we like to call the problem of evil. By this, we mean the question of where evil comes from. Something about the Stoics. Then it says, his principal leanings were toward the other significant philosophy of late antiquity, Neoplatonism. Here, he came across the idea that all existence is divine in nature. Another quick place I want to stop at before wrapping this part up too is he believed, like Plotinus, on page 177, that evil is the absence of God. Evil has no independent existence. It is something that is not, for God's creation is in fact only good. Something that is not is absence. Or, in his own words, the good will is God's work, the evil will is the falling away from God's work. Now, we went into more detail about what the problem of evil can be posed as in the in-depth look section. Go take a look at that again if you want to get into the weeds somewhat on that one. One thing we didn't really talk about is, what is theology? Theology is not the same thing as philosophy of religion, and we don't want to confuse the two. Most of what, as far as I'm concerned, everything that we are discussing, I mean, we can discuss theology, but we're not operating under theology. We're using philosophy to talk about religions and to talk about concepts like the Abrahamic God and so forth, but we're not presuming that those things, the tenets of those religions, nor the existence of that God are the starting point. That's one of the big differences here. Theology is literally broken down the study, the logos or logi part of theology, the study of theo or deus or whatever version of that you want, theo being God, the study of God. So you're assuming in the first place that God is an existing thing, and to be a theologian simply means you're not interested. Trying to come up with a proof for God is less an exercise for the sake of protecting him from those who would not believe in him or her, but so much as it's a chance to simply exercise reason, and that the reason and rationale that God gave us, observe and uphold him as the incredible deity he is, as it were. So that is the mindset of a theologian. As philosophers of religion, or in a philosophy of religion, we can talk about the elements of religion without having to buy into their accuracy or their assuming they were historically correct or not. We can simply talk about the themes and elements without having to buy into their, what we say is, veracity. Last part, a couple of questions with an extra, as it were. I wanted to touch on this too. So what parallels are there between Alberto's biography analogy for Aquinas' theology and the nature of this book? This one is interesting. So I want to look at pages 183 through 4. Here we go. Bottom of page 183 says, if you start at when you read this book, they're talking about Steinbeck and his book of Mice and Men. When you read this book, Steinbeck's book, which is Steinbeck's creation, you get to know something about Steinbeck's nature as well. but you cannot expect to get any personal information about the author. Could you tell from reading of Mice and Men how old the author was when he wrote it, where he lived, or how many children he had? Of course not. But you can find this information in a biography of John Steinbeck. Only in a biography or an autobiography can you get better acquainted with Steinbeck, the person. That's true. That's more or less how it is with God's creation and the Bible. We can recognize that there is a God just by walking around in the natural world. We can easily see that he loves flowers and animals. Otherwise, he would not have made them. But information about God, the person, is only found in the Bible or in God's autobiography, if you like. This next comment is actually important. I'm not going to skip this. Sophie says, "You're good at finding examples." For the first time, Alberto just sat there thinking, without answering. What is that? What is this beat about? Is he just being humble? This is what I want you to think about. I can't give the answer away. Except to say, probably not, right? I mean, if you can't tell already, I'm implying he's not. No, it's not just about humility. There's something else going on here. What is Sophie calling Alberto out on? She's going to make another comment like this, not too much later, similar to this. He is really good at finding examples. And he's very eloquent in describing all this history. He knows all these dates, etc., etc. Very interesting. Think about that for a little bit. And think about the analogy as best you can. What would that mean in the context of any book you read? Not just of Mice or Men, not just the Bible, but what other books can you use as examples of getting to know what that person cares about or thinks about without really getting to know the person? The last extra question that I don't believe is on the handout, but you're welcome to pause the video and think about first before hearing my thoughts, is what is significant about Alberto and Sophie's discussion on the nature of God and time? This is also an extremely interesting, sweet little gem. This one you can find on page 185, in the middle of the page. Blah, 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 blah. Basically, God rules above the angels, Sophie. He can see and know everything in one single coherent vision. So he can see us now? Yes, perhaps he can. But not now. For God, time does not exist as it does for us. Our now is not God's now. Because many weeks pass for us, they do not necessarily pass for God. That's creepy, Sophie exclaimed. She put her hand over her mouth. Alberto looked down at her, and Sophie continued. I got another card from Hilda's father yesterday. He wrote something like, even if it takes a week or two for Sophie, that doesn't have to mean it will be that long for us. That's almost the same as what you said about God. Sophie could see a sudden frown flash across Alberto's face beneath the brown cowl. He ought to be ashamed of himself. Why? Why should he be ashamed of himself? What has he said? What is so wrong here? Alberto knows something, or would seem to know something. There's something he's not sharing. And this should make you pause and reflect back on that earlier chapter when Joanna and Sophie go in and they find the postcards, and there's that whole weird thing about the dates. What was the weird thing about the dates? Well, it was postmarked today. What is today? What is now? Ask yourself these questions. See if you can figure out what is going on as early as possible without cheating, of course, without reading too far ahead, like skipping to the end. No, don't use Cliff Notes. Don't do any of that. But make this fun. Make it as interesting as possible for yourself, because it is. I think it's a blast anyway. All right. That's all for this week. As said, we will meet again next week to talk about the Renaissance. Super exciting. See you then.